When you hear about the misery that existed in the Dublin tenements of the 1900s, all that hardship and poverty, death and disease, it's difficult to make any kind of a connection with the grandeur of places like Trinity College here. Yet most historians agree that if we want to understand why the Dublin tenements came into existence, we need to go back to that time when most of these wonderful buildings, and indeed most of Dublin's famous landmarks, were erected. The 18th century. As the grandeur of Trinity College strongly implies, Dublin was a very different place in the 18th century from the depressed, slum-ridden city it became later on. George in Dublin possessed great buoyancy and vigour, qualities that stemmed from its role as a seat of government. Ireland was a possession of the British Crown at the time, but the people who sat in the Irish Parliament House, the building here behind me and now obviously the Bank of Ireland, exercised real political power. This gave Dublin an air of glamour and confidence. Some people even called it the second city of the British Empire. But underneath, things were nowhere near as rosy or as stable as they seemed.
Although Dublin in the 18th century was the second city of the British Empire, certainly one of the top 10 cities in terms of size and wealth in all of Europe, it was still very much a divided city. The Irish Parliament was, it must be remembered, a Protestant parliament. Catholics got the right to vote in small numbers in 1793, but in a way the Protestant parliament was there to protect the interests of the exclusive Protestant ascendancy. 9/10 of the population were Catholic, and they were completely excluded from the political system. They would have felt completely marginalised, and again that feeds into the resentment that culminated then in the 1798 rebellion.
The rebellion was a brave but ill-fated attempt to throw off British rule. The rebels were heavily outnumbered, and the uprising was easily suppressed as a result. This was a major blow to Irish pride, and it was quickly followed by another, the passing by the British Parliament in London of an extremely significant piece of legislation, the Act of Union of 1801. The Act of Union led to the closure of the Irish Parliament House. This room here, once the debating chamber of the House of Lords, is all that's left of its elegant interior. It also meant the introduction of direct rule from London. Now, as the Parliament was a severely compromised institution, you might be thinking that didn't matter much. But it did. The Act of Union had extremely powerful and long-lasting effects, especially on Dublin.
After the Act of Union, Dublin starts to sink. You have a flight of the aristocracy, of the bishops, of rich merchants out of the city, in some cases to London, obviously, because that's where the focus of Parliament shifts to. Once you don't have a Parliament in Dublin any longer, that changes the whole complexion of the city.
When that happened, the upper echelons of society moved back to London. With them, they took their demand for luxury goods and so on, and all of the services that required the very high quality craftsmanship and so on. That had been a feature of Dublin in the 18th century.
The exodus from the city of the rich and powerful sparked off an economic depression, which dragged on for much of the 19th century. But the Act of Union wasn't bad for everyone. As Anglo-Irish aristocrats abandoned the grand city centre houses, which they'd had built for themselves when times were good, other people, Catholics as well as Protestants, spotted an opportunity and grabbed it with both hands.
Suddenly then you see in the squares the more middle-class people moving in, top barristers like Daniel O'Connell. So by the 1820s, it's mainly merchants and other kinds of businessmen and lawyers and judges that are moving in.
The lucky purchasers of elegant houses like this must have been absolutely thrilled at the splendor and comfort of their new home, which of course in many cases they picked up at knockdown prices. Their fortunate descendants could probably still be occupying the houses they bought today if it wasn't for an unforeseen event. the catastrophic failure of the Irish potato crop in the mid-1840s and the subsequent onset of the Great Famine. The outbreak of the Great Famine during the 1840s didn't only devastate the Irish countryside, it had a big effect on Dublin as well. Dispossessed people, no one knows how many, flocked into the city in the wake of the disaster. Their arrival made some of Dublin's existing inhabitants think again about where they wanted to live. The members of Dublin's middle-class elite certainly didn't fancy the idea of sharing their inner city neighborhoods with thousands of half-starved people. I mean, what's the point of having sweeping staircases and high-ceiling salons with the stench of poverty, not to mention disease, wafting through every window? We're not putting up with this, I can hear them say. We're off to the suburbs. Dublin was bounded at that time by two 18th century canals, which still exist today. Just outside these waterways lay numerous newly formed settlements, to which the eyes of prosperous Dubliners were now increasingly drawn.
Outside the city proper, you have these burgeoning suburban townships, we call them. You have places like Rathmines and Rathgar, you've got the Pembroke Estate, the Ballsbridge area, you've got Drumcondra, you've got Clontarf. To the west of the city, you've got Inchicore, and they're very attractive places to live. So the wealthy are moving out without pause, really. There's a constant shift out of the wealthiest to the new suburban townships.
Dublin, meanwhile, was sinking fast. People whom we'd call property developers had realized by now that a great deal of money could be made by buying up houses that had been built for the very rich and subdividing them into meanly proportioned tenements aimed at the very poor. Whole areas were turned upside down in this way, and before long, the entire city was transformed.
It takes about 10 years for the individual streets in the North City to go from being aristocratic into slums. It's quite phenomenal, the speed at which subdivision happened. It was very much a downward spiral.
Well, already by 1879, 47% of the population, so almost half of the people in the city, were living in tenements. So we know that it was a very considerable portion of the population, about 112,000 people were living in tenements at that stage. And the situation seemed to be getting worse. Practically no area of the city was without its tenements or without its slums.